Welcome to the deep dive.
This time, you're in for a fascinating journey into the world of Buddhist thought. We're exploring 30 Verses on Consciousness by Vasubandhu, a key text in Yogacara Buddhism. Our primary source is a Finnish book that translates and analyzes Vasubandhu's work. Think of this deep dive as an upgrade to your mental operating system, helping you understand your mind, consciousness, and reality itself.
What's fascinating about Vasubandhu is that his work is as relevant today as it was centuries ago. We're talking about a 4th, 5th century Indian monk and philosopher who's considered a founder of Yogacara Buddhism. He wrote extensively, though only a small fraction of his work survive. 30 Verses on Consciousness is one of his later writings and really gets to the core of his thinking.
Okay, so Yogacara Buddhism, I'm picturing some intense yoga poses combined with deep philosophical debates. Am I close?
Not quite. While Yogacara does translate to yoga practice, the focus here is on mental discipline and transformation, not physical postures. It's about understanding the mind's workings and how our consciousness shapes our experience of reality.
Mental yoga. I like it. But before we go full on philosophy mode, can you give me a quick overview of where this all fits into the bigger picture of Buddhism?
You're right. Buddhism is vast. With different schools and traditions, Vasubandhu and his half-brother Asanga were central figures in Mahayana Buddhism, a movement that emerged after the initial teachings of the Buddha. Yogacara is a branch of Mahayana that draws heavily from Abhidharma.
Abhidharma, what's that all about?
Think of Abhidharma as the psychology and philosophy wing of Buddhism. It's like a detailed user manual for your mind, breaking down mental processes and helping you understand how your mind works.
A user manual for the mind. Now, that's something I could definitely use, but why should I? Living in the 21st century, care about this ancient mental manual?
Because understanding the mind is timeless. The core principles of Buddhism and what Abhidharma explores are about understanding the human condition itself. Take the Four Noble Truths, for example. They're the foundation of all Buddhist thought, and they address something we still grapple with today.
You mean like stress, dissatisfaction, and the search for happiness?
Exactly. The Four Noble Truths aren't religious dogma. They're observations about the nature of life. First, life inherently involves suffering, or dukkha, as it's called in Buddhism.
Okay. I think we can all relate to that one.
Right. The second truth is that this suffering arises from craving and attachment, wanting things to be different than they are, clinging to fleeting pleasures.
So it's about that constant wanting and grasping that never seems to be satisfied.
Exactly. Now, here's the good news. The third truth is that there's a way to cease this suffering.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about this cessation of suffering.
It's achieved through the fourth truth, the Eightfold Path. This path outlines how we can cultivate ethical conduct, mental discipline, and wisdom to free ourselves from suffering.
So it's not just about understanding the problem, but actually having a path to a solution.
Precisely. And that's where Vasubandhu's 30 verses come in. He's not just describing these truths. He's giving you a practical guide to working with your mind, to move towards that freedom from suffering.
Okay. I'm starting to see why this is like upgrading my mental operating system. But let's dive into the verses themselves. I'm ready for that upgrade.
One of Vasubandhu's key ideas is consciousness only, sometimes called mind only. But before you think he's saying the world only exists in our heads, it's more nuanced than that.
So it's not like if I close my eyes, the world disappears. There's a real world out there, right?
Absolutely. It's more about the idea that our experience, our consciousness, is the primary lens through which we engage with and interpret reality. Your perceptions, thoughts, and emotions color everything you encounter.
Okay, so it's not that the external world doesn't exist. It's more that our minds play a big role in how we experience it.
Exactly. Understanding this can be incredibly freeing because it means we have more power to shape our reality than we might realize. We're not just passive recipients of external stimuli. We're actively creating our experience through our minds.
That's a pretty powerful idea. But how do we actually start to see through those mental filters and experience reality more clearly?
Well, that's where Vasubandhu's model of the 8 consciousnesses comes in. He's basically giving us a roadmap of our minds.
8 consciousnesses? That's a lot to wrap my head around. I thought we only had 5 senses.
We do. But Yogacara expands on those basic 5. You have the 5 sense consciousnesses. Sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. Then there's the 6th, thought consciousness, which handles mental processing, thoughts, and even dreams.
Okay, 6 down, 2 to go. What are those last 2 consciousnesses?
The 7th is self-consciousness. This is where our sense of self, our ego arises, is what differentiates me from everything else.
Ah, so that's where all the self-doubt and ego trips come from.
You could say that. And finally, there's the eighth consciousness, the storehouse consciousness. It's the most intriguing one.
Okay, I'm all ears. Tell me more about the storehouse consciousness.
Think of it as a vast reservoir of all your past experiences, karmic seeds, and potential. It influences your present experience without you even being aware of it. Ever wonder why you keep repeating certain patterns? Or reacting in predictable ways? That's storehouse consciousness at work.
So it's like our subconscious mind, the part of us that's running the show behind the scenes.
Precisely. And this is a key takeaway for you. Vasubandhu wants us to become aware of the influence of this storehouse consciousness, because it's often the source of our habitual patterns, even those that cause us suffering.
Okay, this is starting to get really interesting. I'm starting to see how understanding these 8 consciousnesses can give us more insight into our own minds and behaviors, but is there an actual real world out there, independent of our minds, or are we just making it all up in our heads?
That's where Vasubandhu's concept of the 3 natures of phenomena comes in. He's saying that everything we experience has these 3 aspects: constructed, dependent, and perfected.
3 natures. Okay, break it down for me. What does it mean for something to be constructed?
The constructed nature is the reality our minds create.
Yeah.
By labeling, categorizing, and conceptualizing. It's the world of tree, house, good, bad. All mental constructs we use to make sense of things.
So it's like our minds are creating a map of reality, but the map isn't the territory itself.
Exactly. We get so caught up in our mental maps that we forget they're just representations, not the ultimate reality.
Okay, that makes sense. What about the second nature, the dependent nature?
This points to the fact that nothing exists in isolation. All phenomena arise in relation to each other, interconnected in a web of cause and effect. Think about the butterfly effect. A small action can have ripple effects across the globe. Everything is connected.
Wow, I never thought about it that way. So our actions, thoughts, and even our mental constructs are all part of this interconnected web.
Precisely. And the third nature, the perfected nature, refers to the ultimate nature of reality. Beyond our dualistic thinking and mental constructs, it's what's left when we drop all the labels and categories.
So it's the raw, unfiltered reality that exists before our minds get involved and start dividing everything up.
You got it. And here's a practical example from Vasubandhu's work. Our daily experience is often colored by conventional values and habits. We're caught up in that constructed reality. But when we start to see the dependent nature of things, how everything is interconnected, it can lead to a more profound understanding. Eventually, we might even glimpse the perfected nature, a perception free from all those mental constructs.
That sounds pretty profound, but also a bit abstract. How does this actually play out in our everyday lives?
Think about it this way. How much of your daily experience is shaped by the stories your mind creates, the judgments you make, the fears you hold, the desires you chase? Are those based on ultimate reality, or are they constructs of your mind?
Wow, you're right. So much of my stress comes from those stories I tell myself.
Exactly. And that's what Vasubandhu is inviting us to see, the power of our minds to create both suffering and liberation. But he doesn't just leave us with this theoretical framework. He offers us a path, a way to work with our minds skillfully.
Okay, I'm ready for that. I want to know how to upgrade my mental operating system and start experiencing more of that freedom and clarity you're talking about.
Well, that's where things get really practical. Remember how we talked about Abhidharma being like a user manual for your mind? In the 30 verses, Vasubandhu outlines both wholesome and unwholesome mental factors. It's like a guide to recognizing what's beneficial for your mind and what's not.
It's like a mental inventory, figuring out what mental habits are serving me and which ones are holding me back.
Exactly. He gets very specific about what those wholesome and unwholesome factors are. But before we dive into those, let's take a quick break. We'll be back in a moment to explore how to cultivate a more skillful and liberated mind.
Okay, we're back and ready to dive into the practical side of things. Before the break, you mentioned Vasubandhu outlines both wholesome and unwholesome mental factors in his 30 verses. It sounds like he's giving us a roadmap to navigate our inner landscape.
That's a great way to put it. And remember, the goal isn't to become some kind of emotionless robot. It's about recognizing those mental states, understanding their causes and effects, and then learning to work with them skillfully.
It's like having a toolbox of mental skills to help us navigate the ups and downs of life. Give me some examples of those wholesome mental factors, those tools we want to be using.
He actually gets super specific. He talks about the 5 special factors of skillful mental activity: intention, determination, mindfulness, concentration, and wisdom.
5 special factors. Okay, let's unpack those. What does he mean by intention?
Think of intention as setting your mind in the right direction, like having a clear purpose.
Yeah.
It's about aligning your actions with your values and aspirations.
Like choosing to approach challenges with a positive attitude instead of getting bogged down by negativity.
Exactly. Then you have determination, which is the effort you put into cultivating those wholesome mental states. It's the perseverance to stay on the path even when things get tough.
So, it's about having that grit and commitment to keep practicing, even when we're not feeling particularly inspired.
You got it. Now, mindfulness, that's all the rage these days. But what does it mean in the context of Vasubandhu's teachings?
Yeah, it's one of those buzzwords that gets thrown around a lot. But I'm curious to hear how it fits into this framework.
For Vasubandhu, it's about paying attention to your experience in the present moment without judgment. It's the key to becoming aware of those mental patterns and habits we've been talking about.
So, noticing those knee-jerk reactions and unhelpful thought loops?
Precisely. And instead of getting swept away by them, you simply observe them with a sense of curiosity and non-judgment. This allows you to create space between stimulus and response, giving you more choice in how you react.
Okay, that makes sense. What about concentration? I struggle with that one. My mind is always jumping around.
Concentration is all about focusing your mind, like a laser beam. It's the ability to stay present with a chosen object of attention, whether it's your breath, a mantra, or even a task you're working on.
So, it's about training our minds to stay focused, instead of getting distracted by every little thing.
Exactly. And it's a skill that can be developed through consistent practice, like meditation.
Okay. I'm starting to see how all these factors work together, but what about that last one? Wisdom. How do we cultivate that?
Wisdom is the culmination of all these factors. It's the deep understanding that arises from cultivating intention, determination, mindfulness, and concentration. It's seeing things as they really are, free from delusion and ignorance.
It's like all those other factors are the building blocks of wisdom.
Precisely. And wisdom is what allows us to make skillful choices, to act in ways that are aligned with our deepest values and aspirations. It's what guides us on the path to liberation.
This is a pretty solid framework for a skillful mind. But let's be real, we don't always operate from those wholesome mental states. What about the flip side? Those mental factors that can lead us astray.
Right. Vasubandhu doesn't shy away from the dark side. He calls these the unwholesome or impure mental factors: anger, jealousy, pride, delusion, the whole shebang.
So it's like acknowledging that we all have those negative emotions and tendencies.
Exactly. And just like with the wholesome factors, he breaks them down into specific categories. There are primary impurities, like attachment, aversion, pride, ignorance, and doubt.
Okay. I can see how those would lead to all sorts of inner turmoil. Can you give me some examples of how these play out in our lives?
Think about attachment. We get attached to people, possessions, ideas, even our own identities.
Yeah.
And when those things change or disappear, we suffer.
Yeah, I definitely relate to that. I've experienced so much heartbreak from clinging to relationships that were no longer serving me.
Exactly. And then there's aversion. We push away things we find unpleasant or painful, even if those things are ultimately for our growth and well-being.
Like avoiding difficult conversations or procrastinating on tasks that we know we need to do.
Precisely. And then there's pride, which can inflate our ego and blind us to our own shortcomings. Ignorance keeps us trapped in limiting beliefs and patterns, while doubt undermines our confidence and prevents us from taking action.
Wow. Those are some powerful forces. And you said there were secondary impurities too. What are those all about?
Those get even more specific. Things like rage, hypocrisy, conceit, malice, and laziness. They're like the offshoots of those primary impurities, the ways they manifest in our thoughts, words, and actions.
Okay, this is starting to feel like a therapy session, but it's incredibly insightful to have these mental states laid out so clearly. It's like having a roadmap to our inner landscape.
And the beauty of it is that Vasubandhu doesn't just describe these mental states. He gives us practical guidance on how to work with them. Remember, it's not about suppressing or denying those unwholesome thoughts and emotions. It's about recognizing them, understanding their causes and effects, and then choosing not to be ruled by them.
So how do we actually do that? How do we stop those negative emotions from taking over?
That's where those wholesome mental factors we talked about come in. They're like the antidotes to the unwholesome ones. By cultivating loving kindness, compassion, generosity, and wisdom, we're essentially strengthening the good mental muscles so they can outflex the bad ones.
I love that analogy. It's like going to the mental gym and building up our inner resilience. So it's not about trying to get rid of those negative emotions altogether. It's more about learning to manage them skillfully.
Exactly. Think of it like this. You can't prevent the waves from coming, but you can learn to surf.
That's a great metaphor. So how do we become better surfers of our own emotions? What are some concrete practices we can use to cultivate those wholesome mental states
No.
and work with those unwholesome ones?
Well, that's what we'll explore when we come back after the break. Stay tuned.
We're back and ready to ride those waves of emotion. Before the break, we were talking about how to cultivate those wholesome mental factors and work with the unwholesome ones. It sounds like it's all about finding that balance, right?
Exactly. Think of it as mental training. Just like an athlete trains their body to perform at its best, we can train our minds to be more resilient, focused, and compassionate.
Okay, so what are some of the specific practices Vasubandhu recommends? For this mental training, I'm ready to hit the mental gym.
Well, he emphasizes a few key practices. Remember those wholesome mental factors we talked about? Loving kindness, compassion, generosity, and wisdom. Those aren't just concepts to think about. They're qualities to actively cultivate.
So how do we actually cultivate those qualities? It sounds a bit abstract.
It could be as simple as starting your day by setting an intention to be kind and compassionate to yourself and others throughout your day. Notice when you're judging yourself or others,
Right.
and practice offering understanding and forgiveness instead.
So it's about catching ourselves in those moments of negativity and consciously choosing a different response.
Exactly. And it's not about being perfect. It's about recognizing when you've fallen into old patterns and gently guiding yourself back to those wholesome qualities.
That makes sense. It's like we're training a puppy with patience and positive reinforcement. But what about those deeper-rooted patterns, those habits that seem to keep repeating themselves, no matter how hard we try to change them?
That's where practices like meditation and mindfulness come in. They're like tools to help us become more aware of those unconscious patterns and create space to choose a different response.
Okay, so meditation isn't just about relaxation and stress reduction. It's actually about rewiring our brains.
Exactly. By practicing mindfulness meditation, we're training our minds to become more aware of our thoughts, emotions, and sensations without judgment. This allows us to see those habitual patterns more clearly and start to loosen their grip on us.
So it's like we're becoming observers of our own minds rather than being controlled by them.
You got it. And as we become more aware, we can start to make different choices. We can choose to respond to challenging situations with wisdom and compassion, rather than reacting out of habit or fear.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all ties together, but let's go back to the bigger picture. We've talked about the 8 consciousnesses, the 3 natures of phenomena, and all these mental factors. How does this all relate to the concept of liberation? What does it actually mean to be liberated in the context of Vasubandhu's teachings?
That's the million-dollar question. Remember, in Yogacara Buddhism, liberation isn't about escaping the world or achieving some static state of perfection. It's about transforming our relationship to the world, to our experiences, and to our own minds.
So it's not about becoming some kind of enlightened being who floats above the messiness of life. We're still human rights.
Absolutely, we're still human. But we're human beings who are waking up from the dream of delusion, from that constructed reality that keeps us trapped in suffering.
So it's like we're seeing the world with fresh eyes, without all those layers of conditioning and mental filters.
Precisely. And we're recognizing that our true nature, that Dharmakaya we talked about, is already inherently free and pure. It's just obscured by all that mental clutter.
So liberation is not about becoming something we're not. It's about uncovering what's already there.
Exactly. And that uncovering is a process, a journey of awakening that unfolds in each moment. It's about bringing that awakened awareness to every aspect of our lives, from the mundane to the profound.
Okay, that makes sense. But if our true nature is already free and pure, why do we experience so much suffering? What's blocking us from experiencing that liberation?
Vasubandhu would say it's those 3 afflictions we talked about earlier: greed, hatred, and delusion. They're like the root causes of all those unwholesome mental factors that keep us trapped in cycles of suffering.
Right. Greed keeps us constantly wanting more. Hatred fuels our anger and resentment. And delusion keeps us blind to reality.
Exactly. And liberation, in a sense, is about freeing ourselves from the grip of those afflictions. It's about seeing through the illusions they create and recognizing that true happiness and fulfillment come from within, not from external circumstances or possessions.
So it's not about suppressing those afflictions or pretending they don't exist. It's more about transforming our relationship to them.
Precisely. It's about recognizing when they arise, understanding their causes, and choosing not to be ruled by them. It's about responding to them with wisdom and compassion, rather than reacting out of habit or ignorance.
So it's like we're learning to ride the waves of those afflictions without getting capsized.
That's a great way to put it. And that's where the practice of non-attachment comes in again. It's about recognizing that those afflictions are impermanent. Like everything else, they arise and pass away, just like thoughts, emotions, and even our sense of self.
So it's about letting go of that clinging to those afflictions, to those stories our minds create about them.
Exactly. And as we cultivate that non-attachment, we start to experience a greater sense of freedom and peace, even in the midst of those challenging emotions.
Okay, this has been an incredible deep dive. We've covered so much ground, and my mind is definitely feeling stretched and expanded. But I have to admit, I'm still left with some questions.
And that's a good thing. These ideas are meant to spark our curiosity and invite us on a lifelong journey of exploration and discovery.
So where do we go from here? What can our listeners do to continue their own deep dive into these ideas?
Vasubandhu's 30 verses are just the starting point. Seek out a full translation of his work, explore other Yogacara or Buddhist texts, and most importantly, apply what you've learned to your own life. Observe your mind, cultivate those wholesome qualities, and see how your experience of reality begins to shift.
It's like we've been given a treasure map, and now it's up to each of us to embark on our own adventure of self-discovery.
Exactly. Remember, the path to liberation is a journey, not a destination. It's a process of continuous learning, growth, and transformation. And the rewards are immeasurable.
Well, on that note, we've reached the end of our deep dive into Vasubandhu's 30 verses on consciousness. We hope you've enjoyed exploring these profound ideas with us.
And remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep practicing, and keep diving deeper into the fascinating world of your own mind.
Until next time, fellow deep divers, happy diving.